Good afternoon and welcome to the JFK Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Mark Guerin, I'm the director here, and we warmly welcome you to this afternoon's forum. For the past few weeks, 50 days before the election at the Institute of Politics, we've been reminding students that every day counts. We're every day at the Institute. They can attend forums like this, engage with our fellows and study groups, participate with our Harvard Votes Challenge on voter election and participation, where every day counts. And so as we wind towards the final 2 weeks before this critical election, we warmly welcome you to today's forum, where we'll focus on some of the newsroom decisions behind the actual coverage on election night. Certainly since the 2000 presidential contest of Bush and Gore, we've all come to know that on election night, we don't always know the election results. In this year, many observed that during the pandemic, with the significant increase in early voting and mail-in ballots and late ballots, and in this environment fraught with heightened polarization and the threats of misinformation, newsrooms are making very tough but important decisions of how to call and report close elections. And so we have teamed up with the Shorenstein Center here at the Kennedy School and its great director, Nancy Gibbs, to bring together a panel of newsroom executives and longtime reporters and observers of American politics on the decisions behind election night coverage. The panel will consider with Nancy the question of coverage standards, how they use the platform in the reporting to educate the public on some of the nuances and complexities of election laws. How could their reporting perhaps mitigate some of the confusion around election results? And who decides and at what point the kind of information and standards to eventually report a winner on election night or beyond? So to help us better understand these issues, we've invited these newsroom executives to discuss the flow of information and the critical judgment calls that they will be making on election night. So we warmly welcome and thank, first of all, Brian Carovillano, who's the Vice President and Managing Editor of the Associated Press, David Chalian, who's also Vice President and Political Director of CNN, and Chuck Todd, moderator of NBC's Meet the Press. They will be in conversation with Nancy Gibbs, who is the Director of the Shorenstein Center for Media and Politics and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School, and of course, the well-regarded former editor-in-chief of Time magazine, where she knows well the judgment calls made in election coverage over the course of her impressive career. But before I turn it over to Nancy, I also invite everyone back next week to a doubleheader where we're on Wednesday, October 28th, we will host two forums. The first at noon with the topic catalyzing global leadership to limit the impact and contain the impact of COVID-19. We're fortunate to have Peter Sands, who's the Executive Director of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS and Tuberculosis and Malaria. He will be in conversation with Dr. Atul Gawande, the noted surgeon and public health expert on this important topic. Later that day at 6 p.m., the 30th Theodore White lecture on press and politics, hosted by the Institute of Politics with the Shorenstein Center, will bring Eugene Robinson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Washington Post and associate editor, will deliver a talk entitled The Challenges Facing the Media on November 3rd and beyond. And we're grateful to Nancy Gibbs for bringing Eugene here to the Kennedy School. So with our thanks to our panelists, where every day counts, we have the opportunity for this important question of election night coverage. I turn it over to my colleague and friend, Nancy Gibbs, to moderate today's conversation.
Thank you, Mark. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for joining us in the middle of Democracy Super Bowl, when sometimes it feels like we are playing by a whole new set of rules. So let's start there. Brian, I have a feeling that most of us don't fully recognize the role that the Associated Press plays in how elections work, how we know, how Chuck and David and everyone else will know what is happening on election night and beyond. Can you just briefly walk us through the role that the AP plays in collecting, tabulating, notifying us about what's happening?
Sure. So the APs, well, first of all, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this because there's a lot to talk about. But the AP's role in US elections is basically threefold. We count the vote, which means we have stringers placed at county election offices and state Secretary of State's offices all across the country, about 4,000 of them. We call the races, so we have our own decision desk, which of course, as do NBC and CNN and all of the networks, but a lot of smaller and mid-sized news organizations really rely heavily on the AP for both vote count and decision desk race calls. And then the third part of it is we cover the election. We do journalism on everything from the candidates and the voters, especially the voters, to election security and misinformation and voting access, and this year perhaps civil unrest. And so we cover the election same as everyone else. A fourth thing that we are now doing in combination with our partners at NORC at the University of Chicago is a massive voter survey called Votecast, which the AP is doing in lieu of exit polls. The AP pulled out of the exit poll consortium after the 2016 election and developed this new thing that we call Votecast, which I can talk a little bit more about. And so, the AP is, I think, the only organization that does all three of those things. So counts the vote, calls the races, and covers the elections. And so, there are others who do one or two of those things, but the AP is the only one that does all three.
All right, well, I want to come back to Votecast because we are in an interesting situation this year with exit polls. But first of all, let me ask all three of you. We've heard so much about how this is an election unlike any other. What specifically, especially as you think about what you're going to be doing on the night of November 3rd, is going to be different this time? Are you anticipating is going to be different, that you're going to have to do differently? Chuck, why don't you start?
Well, the biggest thing is just the disparity and when some votes get counted, right? That's the biggest thing. I mean, there's certainly going to be in some important battleground states that I think we will get to 95% reporting of the vote in, by 3 o'clock in the morning. I look at, I would say, can we call it by 3 a.m.? Are we going to get to 95% of all votes counted by 3 a.m. in the morning? And there still are some important states that we expect that to be: North Carolina, Florida, Ohio, Arizona. And the Arizona one's a bit of a change, but they now feel there's a lot more confidence there that they're going to be able to count because they're processing their mail ballots. But you take states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, who have all instituted basically some new version of mail-in balloting, some new version of in-person, early vote. And there's some real strict, when can they start processing the ballots? Some of them, I think Michigan can't do it until election day, and I think they were trying to change that, but it's still ongoing. So we could have upwards of 75% of the vote not even tabulated in places like Michigan or Pennsylvania by midnight on election night type of thing. So it is, one of the curiosities I have, and which is, we may have an idea of who won this election, but are we going to be able to technically get to 270 electoral votes and call the presidency, without waiting for some actual vote counts to at least get a reasonable number in? I mean, that could be something that changes. And look, I'm going to stop there, let others come in. I have a lot of concerns about all of the survey work that's going on for the election, whether it's what AP does and its separate deal, and what we're doing with the consortium that both CNN and NBC belong to. But I can punt that until I assume you have a question later on that.
Yes. David, what's different?
Well, I agree with everything that Chuck said. I mean, the biggest difference is Americans are casting their ballots, and states and localities are dealing with a counting of those ballots in ways they never have before. So, I mean, we're just dealing with such a massive influx of vote by mail, absentee vote, and specifically the states Chuck was talking about that don't have a history of dealing with this. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, obviously critical to either person's path to 270 electoral votes. It is that is by far the single biggest difference. And then the other component to it, of course, is what we've learned in all this pre-election polling and in the early vote data that we have is that it's two totally different political universes who are casting their ballots early and by mail, absentee and by mail, versus those who intend to cast their ballots on election day. I mean, Joe Biden voters and Democrats are voting by mail and early, and a lot of this is pandemic related, obviously, and the politicization of the pandemic that we've seen. And Donald Trump supporters and Republicans are far more inclined to say that they are going to cast their ballots in person on election day. So when you have two totally different and significantly so electorates, if you will, it's going to be this constant need on election night to be transparent and explain to the audience at any given moment, you know, these vote totals that you're seeing in X state, this is what's represented in that. This is how much of that is early vote, how much of that is election day vote, because we want to make sure we're not trying to put some puzzle together that we don't have all the pieces for yet. And so we want to be really clear and transparent with the viewer at any moment. This is what we know is included in these numbers you're looking at. This is what we know about what is not included in these numbers you're looking at. And as Chuck was saying, in some places, it's just going to take a really long time for them to count. And so also sort of being clear in these next 11 days, I think, with our audiences about, you know, the need for a little bit of patience here, just because of what we're dealing with in the process of casting and counting ballots in a pandemic.
So let me drill into that for a second, and maybe Brian, you can address this in particular. Is how are you guys going to figure out the denominator, where as you are reporting, and we've heard all the warnings about the red mirage and the blue shift of in putting the vote in context on election night, what is the method by which you're going to assess what that total vote count is, and therefore this is a percentage of the total vote count? What's the methodology for that?
You're looking at expected vote, which is based on, you know, historical voting patterns and early outstanding vote, where those votes are, and trying to come to some sort of a, you know, combination of factors that make it possible to conclude that the trailing candidate can no longer catch the leading candidate. I mean, that's the standard you're looking for. You're looking for certainty that the person who is leading can no longer be caught by the person who is trailing. It's going to be a lot harder in all these states that Chuck and David are talking about to come to that kind of a conclusion in the amount of time that people have become accustomed to on election night. And it's because of all these other factors. I mean, in 2016, we actually had a large number of absentee and early votes, and it was 40%. This year, it's going to be probably somewhere between 50 and 60%. That's a huge increase when you consider the total number of ballots that will be cast in this election. And so it is going to require a collective patience on the part of the country, and understanding that, especially if it comes down to those states that are a little more complex and a little less experienced handling large quantities of early and absentee votes, that it's probably not going to happen on election night. If it comes down to one of the states that have a lot of experience and that we're reasonably certain will be able to count most of their votes on that night, then it could be a different story. But, you know, especially if we get into Pennsylvania, where we still don't know exactly how and when Pennsylvania is going to start counting its early and absentee vote. And it was the subject of a Supreme Court ruling just this week. But even so, I don't think we'll really know until election day exactly how they're going to handle that. Most of the projections that I've seen is that Pennsylvania is the tipping point state. So if that's actually true, then we could be settling in for a pretty long haul.
All right, well, let's talk about Pennsylvania. So election officials there have warned that as many as 100,000 votes could be tossed out because of naked ballots and disqualified mail-in votes, especially with record numbers of mail-in votes. And Trump's margin in Pennsylvania was 44,000 votes last time. So even if you know in advance and are calculating in your projections how many people have voted by mail, you don't know how many of those mail-in votes are going to actually turn out to be counted. So Chuck, there you are on the air trying to be responsible about what we know and what we don't know. But there's no way you can know, even with the modeling, about whether in crucial states, some critical proportion of mail-in ballots might end up not being counted.
Look, there's a couple things that we're trying to put some safeguards in for what you're just talking about. So look, the biggest issue is making sure you know what you just said, that what is the denominator, trying to understand that. And I'm sure Brian's doing the same thing. We've been reaching out, talking to various states, and so you all of us will end up, and this is a case where everybody does kind of work together, because, you know, we do trade information because we all want to make sure we're all dealing with the same framework. We're all trying to check ourselves a little bit, if you will. One of the things we've added on election night for us that viewers are going to see when I'm at the board, for instance, is And when you see 85%, right? And we have said this for a while, that is not precincts reporting, that is 85% of vote, vote is in type of thing, that we're actually going to have be able to, I'm going to hit a button so that you see, and this is the expected total votes cast. So we think there's still, according to this, maybe 300,000, but we know it's an approximation. I mean, what you just outlined are one of the variables here where there is going to be, yeah, we think there might be 300,000 ballots, but I don't know if 100,000 of them are getting tossed. All I can tell you is we know there could be as many as. So another thing that we're doing is, frankly, in every state, and it isn't the same formula, but it really just depends on how good that state is at sort of providing data. We're going to increase, every decision desk has their own certainty rate that they want to get to before they'll say, okay, let's call it. You know what, we're within, I'm comfortable doing it within this range, let's do it. We are basically increasing that padding, if you will, by about a percentage point everywhere.
Wow.
We don't care, Brian, you get to win.
Yeah.
We don't care if we don't call a single race first. You win, Brian. AP can win all you want. We're not doing that. I know my buddy over at Fox wants to do the same thing. We're not in that game this year because, frankly, I think we in the networks have a lot more to lose.
I can't stress enough how much Chuck and I share a brain on this. It is, just to give everyone a sense, here, a tradition inside CNN that we do before every election is we have everyone working on the decision team and working on the elections reread an internal investigative report about the 2000 election and reread the congressional testimony of all the network presidents that went on up to Capitol Hill to testify about the 2000 election. And that's an election eve tradition here at CNN to put that back in our mind.
Wow.
It is
I don't torture my people that way.
it is, we are never, ever, ever going to be about trying to be first in projections. It's just, there's no reason to be. This is one of those things where confidence level in the projection just has to trump everything else. We don't even see, quite frankly, a real competitive edge in being first anyway. And so there's nothing as important to us as only obviously going to air with something that we are so supremely confident to be true in, because there is also going to be so much noise around it that we have to constantly on our air, on our website, to our audiences, make sure that we are bringing only things that we know to be facts and true and context to what they're seeing. And there's just not room or space for that kind of being first competition.
So we've already touched on the fact that both of you, in making those calculations, figuring out that denominator, you're all going to be processing a huge amount of data, but for the first time, two different sets of exit polls. Brian, can you talk about what made the AP pull out of the consortium and talk a little about the difference and the advantages, if there are any advantages, of having two different exit polling operations feeding into newsrooms this time around?
Well, I think to Chuck's point earlier, they're all flawed to start from that point. But the move to VoteCast on AP's part was driven by the fact that so many Americans are voting outside of traditional polling places on election day, which again in 2016 was already 40%. So it was already a significant, and that's not something that just started. I mean, it's been a gradual progression since the early 70s of people moving to alternate ways of voting besides going to their local polling place. But what's happened between 2016 and 2020 is, that has accelerated like 5 election cycles into the future. And so VoteCast was designed to try and reach people in a variety of places. So it does phone, online, and actual mail surveys. It will this year result in about 140,000 surveys returned in all 50 states between October 28th and Election Day itself. Our colleagues at NORC, which is a public opinion polling operation at the University of Chicago, will process all that, delivers the results in real time. It will be, one data point that we're looking at. We won't call a single closely contested state or race based solely on VoteCast, nor did we call those races solely on exit polling when we were part of the consortium. As a journalist, I will say the greatest value is after Election Day, and in the days and the weeks and the months that follow, where you get this incredibly rich idea of who voted demographically, what the issues were that brought them out, where the sort of pivotal moves were made, and most of that stuff you just don't have the time or ability to process on Election Day. It's usually in the aftermath of Election Day, and that to me is where the greatest value of exit polling and votecast comes in.
Well, so Chuck, you indicated that you're having some exit poll nightmares. Tell me what spooks you.
Well, I'll tell you in a second. First of all, one of my favorite lines about exit polls it was right after, it was in the early 90s when the LA Times used to actually do a New Hampshire primary exit poll, and there used to be 2 or 3 different, you'd have 3, sometimes up to 4 different news organizations do an exit poll for some of these primaries and even on election night. And I remember when that went down, one of the statisticians said, the only thing worse than no exit polls is one exit poll, because you don't have anything to double check. I remember in 92, it was a good thing we had 2 different exit polls. In the LA Times exit poll, there were some network exit polls. They were in conflict, but it slowed everybody down. And we realized, boy, nobody had the Buchanan number right, was the point. So I will say this, from a big picture data guy, I'm sorry the AP is not in the consortium, because financially everybody could. However, editorially, I think it's healthy for the very reason I just brought up, in that it's another set of data, it's another set of eyes. You don't get, I've always worried about groupthink, and when all of the major news organizations are fishing on the same thing, you can be concerned about that. But here's my real concern about all of this survey work. Number one, I agree with Brian. I wish we could take the exit poll data, take his data, not let anybody look at it for a week, then you reweight it correctly to actual returns, and then you see the product, and it would be amazing, and it would be wonderful, and it would be this treasure that it should be. What unfortunately is, a bunch of us at networks have abused this exit poll and used it the wrong way. Viewers use it the wrong way. Consumers consume it the wrong way, all of that. Well, think about the problem this year with doing survey work. You want the variety of ways, but the exit poll, what made it great, you had in-person. Now look, we're doing some in-person exit polling at early vote sites. We're doing some in-person on election day, and we're doing surveys, as well for states with the huge early vote. But I want to pick up on something David brought up. The idea that, used to be these different pockets of voters. Well, there wasn't necessarily a known red-blue skew to them. Well, now you're going to have almost all your in-person maybe skews red. All your absentee ballot polling or polling part will skew blue. And I think waiting early. All I will say is this: I'm going to be an exit poll skeptic on election day, meaning I'm not going to be a fan of publicizing these numbers. They're going to change. And by the way, it is healthy that they're going to change. But I think this year they're going to change a lot. And I worry, for instance, people going early was saying, wow, look at this. Joe Biden has got 45% of the white vote. Well, that might be wave 1. By wave 2, it could be down to 39. But you've created this narrative that Joe Biden's overperforming with whites by 6 points. By midnight, man, maybe we ought to reweight that now that we see the returns coming in the T in Pennsylvania and in Iowa and things like that. I just think this year more than ever, there's some of that. And so I know that I'm going to be a bit, at least on my side of the street at NBC, be very public in it. I'll report some numbers, but I'm going to be very skeptical and hold off on some things until we basically see some actual returns. And the other thing I worry about this year is what I call junk analytics, in that you're going to see a lot of modelers on social media. You're going to see a lot of pundits on our airwaves. You're going to see reporters come to you, Brian, at AP saying, hey, I got this guy who showed me this, this analysis of this vote here, and it says that, Biden's going to win North Carolina. Why haven't we called it? I am worried about how the social media world and that having unnecessary influence on some of this journalism. Obviously, I'm trying to gird us against that, but that's another concern I have.
So David, let me pick up on that, on the temptation towards the premature narrative. In the 2018 midterms, as those results were coming in, a CNN commentator said, well, yeah, the Democrats are doing well, but there is no blue wave. Well, turned out that what looked like a 26 seat pickup turned out to be a 41 seat pickup. It's just that we didn't know it for a month. And it's easy to see the powerful temptation in real time to try to see the bigger picture, draw some conclusions. And yet, for all the reasons that you all have been talking about, that's riskier than ever this year. How do you guide your team to resist the temptation of the premature narrative frame?
I mean, it's a constant real-time conversation throughout election. I mean, this is part of my job on election night is literally the real-time slowing everyone down, urging that our job here is not to get ahead of the outcome. Our job is to actually cover what is before us as it's unfolding before us. And we have to not be afraid to do that. Like I said, you're putting together a puzzle, and there are some pieces we just simply can't see until we can see them. And so I am always reminding everyone, there's no reason to get ahead of where we actually are. And so if actually we have a ton of uncalled races, then we shouldn't get ahead of deciding what it's going to look like when they're called. They're currently uncalled. Let's cover that. Why are they uncalled? What do we know about them? What do we know? That is just constantly reminding everyone inside the organization, there's no need to get ahead of ourselves. We just simply have to allow the story to play out and cover it as it does. And it's just a constant real-time conversation.
Could I add to that too? Because both Chuck and David spoke about how they would be more conservative than ever. And let me add the AP's voice to that. I mean, we are always conservative. We would be more conservative than ever on this election day when it comes to race calls. But the second part of that strategy is radical transparency in terms of constantly explaining on the wire, in interviews live on election night, and to anyone who will listen to us, what we understand to be happening, why it's happening, and why it matters. So if you're looking at the wire, if you're looking at our app, if you're hearing us speak, that's the message that we will be giving. Along with, just because it's taking longer doesn't mean there's a problem. It just means that this year is different. And I think that's also a really important message I hope people are starting to understand, is that there will be people claiming that delays equal fraud and problems and election malfeasance. There is no equation between those two things.
Well, so
that's an important point, Brian. I'm so glad you said that. We can't say it enough. Just because it's taking a long time does not mean something is wrong. It's an unprecedented way in which Americans are casting their ballots and how they're being counted.
And
It's the same reminder I give to my son when he rushes a quiz. No. You don't have to rush this.
Well, so I think all of you and many reporters have been very careful to many different ways of phrasing this. It's not election night, it's election week, or a slow count is a careful count, and all of these different ways of trying to manage expectations, which is obviously a very responsible thing to do. But let me now flip the lens a little bit, because as you have educated the public to expect that it may take a long time for very good reason, what happens if in a scenario where by 9-10 o'clock on election night, Florida has gone blue or Ohio has gone blue, and actually you now are increasingly confident that you know where this is going? Have you actually made it harder or made people suspect, well, wait a minute, you were saying that we weren't going to know for days, but now you're calling this race? And this, particularly if you were projecting for Biden to win. Is there actually now a problem with the counseling of patients, that it's possible if patience turns out not to be necessary, you will not be able to legitimately call a winner by the own rules and standards of there is still a lot of outstanding vote, it hasn't been counted yet, and we have to wait, even though the outcome seems increasingly clear to us?
Nancy, you actually are asking a question that one of my colleagues who's deep in the boiler room brought up to me and said, hey, and he said, what if we call Florida, North Carolina, and Ohio for Biden by midnight? We know where this election is going. I just think you simply I'm gonna lean into something that David said earlier, which is, okay, so you just sit on what you know. So we know that. Boy, that means it's unlikely, but we're not going to sit here and say it's, you know, it's really unlikely. It is extraordinarily unlikely. But I actually think we are in a position where we have to acknowledge the most unlikely a little bit. And I think that we can't just shut it down. I think this is where I think the president's Twitter feed has gotten into the head of some of us. You know, there's this concern that somehow he's going to take a delay and through all this. So I'm also worried there's going to be some who say, hey, let's take this. See, it's over. Hey, Trump's got to concede. Trump's got to concede. And at the end of the day, I do think we ought to go through the exercise of making sure we've at least gotten somebody to 270 via our standards, whatever our standards are at NBC, CNN's, APs, before we call, quote, the presidency. But, you know, I think that we shouldn't treat our audiences as idiots either. And if we are calling, if Florida, North Carolina, and Ohio are blue on election night, well, we know the story of this election.
Well, so you just raised the issue. Twitter and Facebook and a lot of news organizations have promised they are not going to be amplifying premature claims of victory. There's been a lot of concern about that. And I assume that obviously applies to both candidates. But I'm wondering about this, because you are going to be so scrupulous in making your calls, and you all have talked about the conservatism that you are going to bring to making those calls. You know, do you worry that because of the nature of social media, that the information ecosystem is just going to barrel right past you, and you end up being the last people to declare an outcome to something that has been all over social media everywhere for ages? Brian, how do you think about that? And I know you have entered, Brian, the AP has just entered into a relationship with big tech, trying to make sure that the AP data is feeding into Alexa and into all the search engines and everything to help keep everything being fact-based, but it still feels like you only have a limited amount of control over what people hear and believe.
If people are making you know, election declarations on election night on Twitter and Facebook, and those either agree or contradict with what we're seeing, it's not going to be of any concern whatsoever. We're going to stick to our process. We're going to stick to our standards, and we're going to call the race when we get to 270 electoral votes, whether that's on election night or, you know, 3 weeks later. And, you know, there's no way really to know. It just comes back to what I was saying before, which is radical transparency. We're just going to explain the heck out of everything that we're doing, including, you know, if it gets to the point where we are in a position to make a declaration on election night or early the next morning, we would explain in great detail exactly how we got to that point and address the fact that, you know, it's unexpected. People had been conditioned to think this was going to take a long time, and here's why we got to where we got faster than we thought was going to be. If either candidate declares victory and the math is not there and the facts are not there, we still have to report that happened. I mean, we'll still be probably watching it live on NBC and CNN and a bunch of other networks. But, you know, the sentence prior and the sentence after is going to say the AP hasn't called the race and here's why. But, you know, you can't ignore it. That's news. You have to report the news. As far as, you know, non-authoritative sources, you know, making projections on Twitter, you know, I hope they're right. I think it would be bad for democracy if they're not right, but it's not going to influence what we're doing on election night.
I want to bring the students into this conversation because they're eager to interrogate you as well. The first question goes to Anand.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Anand. I'm a junior at Harvard College. My dad and I are huge fans of Meet the Press.
Hey, Chuck.
So our question is for Mr. Todd. So a lot of studies have shown that sort of repeating a lot of the misinformation or disinformation that comes out in newsrooms sort of gives them more credibility, and some viewers actually see them as true. And I know there's this huge trend of October surprises in elections, stuff that comes out in the month leading up to it. And I know that disinformation is sort of a bigger deal now whether it's coming straight from the president directly or perhaps even Russian disinformation. How has your newsroom coverage sort of adapted to that new reality?
Well, first of all, we have adapted, and thanks for that, and thank you for being devoted viewers, by the way. I appreciate that. Look, it's simply, I think the biggest change is being careful. Not, I will say this, I think 10 years ago, the New York Post story would have gotten more coverage in the way media used to handle stuff. And I would say, and Nancy, I'm curious if you would concur with that, in that there was the it's out there mentality. And there was an it's out there mentality that I think all of media in the early days of the internet got consumed by a little bit. I do think the fact that, well, I would say, I'm going to be a little crass here. The fact that people have gotten drunk on social media has sobered up American journalists, I would say.
Absolutely.
And so we've been extraordinarily careful now. Verify first, try to, take this Hunter Biden story. We've, I don't want to get off on a tangent here, but, I've had people, how come you guys aren't reporting this? And I've just explained to them individually if they've asked. Well, we've asked Rudy Giuliani for the raw material that he provided the Post and Fox. He hasn't done it. We've asked this other gentleman for that. He hasn't done it. I mean, we've attempted to report the story, and the fact that they're not even attempting to try to help us out, to me, only adds to the skepticism of it, for instance. But this gets to something Brian was just talking about election returns. This gets to what we have to do as a news organization, is also be transparent about what we're doing. Why didn't we report a story? Why did we report a story? But I am more concerned than ever, because one of the things that with misinformation is sometimes debunking misinformation gets the misinformation out there. Mm-hmm. And I do think we all have gotten to be a bit more careful in how we debunk misinformation, so that it isn't accidentally spreading it, if that makes sense. But look, this is a big challenge, and let's just say there were certainly a lot of folks who, like I said, I think social media did a lot of damage on this front, but I do think that you're seeing a change in certainly how major news organizations handle this stuff.
Thank you so much.
Next up is AJ.
Hi, my name is Ajay. I'm a Harvard College sophomore calling in from Jacksonville, Florida. And this question is really for anyone who would like to answer it. So a hallmark of the past few years has been this increased inclination against the media, and sort of this antagonization of the news media that's in some ways like trickled down from the Oval Office down to plenty of state and local administrations. Like I said earlier, I'm from Florida. And there's a number of state and local officials that have engaged in a similar sort of villainization of the media. And I was just curious how this would affect communication of election results, and just that general, just general communication on election night, if at all, especially when we're sort of reliant on local officials in particular for the accurate reporting of election data.
Brian, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I mean, I want to answer that in two ways. I think, A, you can't deviate too much from the way you've always done things, because, these are processes that have been developed over a long time to be as accurate as possible. And so you don't want to deviate from that necessarily. I think you do want to be much more transparent about how you're doing what you're doing, and just kind of, show as much of your process as you possibly can. And that's one way to build confidence. I don't have any illusions that the high percentage of people who say they mistrust the media are suddenly going to change their mind if they, read a few extra paragraphs in a story, that describe how we gather the data or call the races. But I think it helps. I think it demystifies the process a little bit. I think that helps. And when it comes to the, misinformation and stuff that's being put out there, sometimes even by elected officials in some places, debunking and fact checking is just reporting. Right? We know how to report. And, part of the reporting is trying to figure out what is the provenance of that information. What is the chain of custody of the laptop, as Chuck was saying. is as much a part of the story as the story itself. And I think, if you think back to the big October surprise of the 2016 election with John Podesta's email, I think if we collectively made a mistake as the media, it was that we reported on the contents of the hack, but not the hack enough, and how that information came to light. And I think if you look now, that's a big change in how almost every media organization is approaching the provenance of information, whether it's Hunter Biden's laptop or something else, is a big part of it. And it's such an important part of it. And I think, maybe I'm naive, but I think over time, those strategies will help to start rebuilding some of the trust that has been lost in the media.
I'm going to break in with a public service announcement for those of you who are really interested in this tremendous challenge. Our center this week just published its media manipulation casebook, which is a series of case studies in the techniques and mitigation strategies around misinformation. So go to mediamanipulation.org. It is really valuable because, as all of these guys are noting, it is the battlefield is very different this election than it has ever been before, and this is a very significant challenge to newsrooms, and our goal is to help them how to meet that challenge. Next up is Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a sophomore and I'm zooming in here from New York. And thank you so much for being with us today. My question kind of is, so we have this idea that a majority of the early vote and the mail-in vote is going to lean towards the Democrats and towards Joe Biden, and that a lot of the in-person election day vote is going to lean towards Trump. But I guess my question for all of you is, how certain are we that this is actually going to be the case? And is there maybe a hidden Trump vote, one, and two, is there a hidden Trump early vote that could end up turning the election in another way that we didn't think of on election night when you start covering it?
I'll just jump in to say, as Chuck was saying before, you feel a lot better when there are multiple data streams and you're not just relying on one. So if we were only relying on polls of people that showed us that the early vote, absentee vote, was going dramatically to Biden versus Trump, you might have that concern. But then you add on that the actual party ID breakdown where it's available in states of the returned ballots. You can start to see multiple data streams that point to this seems to be the way in which the people are, that their vote method is indeed tied to their partisanship or their candidate choice here. It may not be as dramatically a big advantage. And again, this goes to the precise caution of how we will all treat election night, which is that we can enter with an understanding of where we believe that early vote to be, but then the votes actually get tabulated and reported. And in some states, some are better at this than others in terms of what do you call it, Brian? Radical transparency. Some states are very good at telling us exactly in this vote report, X, percent of the vote is early vote, X percent is election day vote. In this vote report, there's no early vote. Some states are a little less good at being able to give us that information in real time. But again, it means that we can enter with an understanding of what we believe to be the trend in this particular area, and then actually watch the votes get tabulated. If it doesn't match up with our preconceived notion, that's going to give us all even more pause into what we're talking about on election night.
Can I just jump in real quick though, on this idea that there's a hidden Trump vote? I will go to my grave believing there's not a hidden Trump vote, and there wasn't one in 2016. What it was pollsters didn't correctly poll the Trump vote. And I do believe I think we have an idea of how it got under-polled, but it wasn't hidden. This wasn't about lying to pollsters. This wasn't any of that. We have actually done multiple studies on that. That was not the case. What we believe is the case, it was a simple error that old-fashioned random digit dial has created an error in in our ability to poll rural counties in a way that essentially made all of the polling with the rural counties, which ended up going about 80-20 Trump. When rural America was more 60-40, this issue of problem of polling in rural America would wash out in large samples. but because it was such a huge monolithic split this time in rural America, that created the, and I'm going to get in the weeds here, but because of random digit dial, in the most rural counties, we were not polling in the most rural parts of the rural counties. So even in the rural counties, too many polls were getting moderate Republicans or moderate voters, not those conservative voters that were out there that was missed. So I just throw that out there. I know there's shorthand, hidden Trump vote, this or that. It wasn't hidden, didn't lie. We just didn't poll it correctly. And I say we, meaning the collective polling community of 2016.
If there was an undercount of non-college educated white voters in 2016, the pollsters have tried to correct for. We also have been reading about the very deliberate efforts of the Republican Party to register many more of the previously unregistered non-college educated white voters. So if it is true that we may be looking at record turnout north of 150 million people, how much does it mess up all of your models if you have voters who previously were not registered, have never voted before, you don't have a track record of where they fit into the ecosystem?
I'll give you another one, by the way. Do you know that there are 3 million fewer non-college educated whites than there were in 2016? Not as a percentage, as a raw vote. So I'll throw that into your data stream too. So yes, you've seen the Trump campaign ad, but we were just, in fact, this was just a thing one of my guys was just sharing with me today. He says, by the way, and I thought he was saying, you know, as it was percentage-wise down, it was like, no, a raw, there are 3 million fewer non-college educated whites on the, you know, in the vote files. Anyway, it's just sort of, it's just among the different challenges. But look, I know we certainly have, I don't know what you want to call it, subscription, whatever. We have access to a couple of voter files that we use now. Both our NBC Wall Street Journal poll is sampled out of voter files now. So we lean more heavily on these voter files to sort of double and triple check things more than ever. And you know, I don't know what others are doing and whether they work with any of these voter file companies, but that has been yet another way we've tried to sort of check our work, if you will.
Brian and David, how are you making those adjustments?
I agree with everything Chuck said. I don't have that much else to add other than that's another great reason for caution and all the things that we've been talking about here. And, you know, just because you refresh 538 37 times a day doesn't mean you know what the outcome of the election is going to be. That's directionally interesting information, but it is not predictive of what the outcome of the election will be.
Thank you.
Amen.
For saying that. Say it 100,000 times.
So, you know, rigging an election in favor of a particular candidate is much harder than undermining public confidence in the election. And so I'm curious about how each of you think about how you are going to distinguish in the coming days between normal problems that just happen because our electoral infrastructure is messy and our system is incredibly localized versus deliberate efforts at malfeasance, interference. How do you walk the line between normal things that are going wrong and dangerous, threatening things that are going wrong?
I mean, this is a real, you know, big J journalism project, right? I mean, that you do it by your reporting, and that is why. I mean, I'm sure these other organizations as well, but speaking for CNN, we have more repertorial resources dedicated to the voting process than we ever have before. In more places, in greater numbers, teams of people who have been source building with county officials and local. I mean, this has been for months now, just building a real voting reporting operation that is exactly designed, Nancy, at what you're describing, so that we can separate what is the regular, messy, as you described, process and very decentralized, perhaps thankfully, given foreign actors' desires, but process that we have in the country in administration of our elections, and where there is an actual real problem. You know, the other thing I think that is helpful in this, and I know so much of this gets politicized and, you know, people want to, but I do think there has been a bipartisan consensus in many ways about this notion of widespread voter fraud just not being an actual thing. And I do think, whereas to me, it's almost like what used to be in our business a decade ago. I think you used to see a lot more battles about climate change and whether it existed or not, and that sort of drifted away. And I think the same thing with this notion of widespread voter fraud. I don't think that that's whether or not that exists, I don't think is an acceptable debate anymore. I feel like overall the mainstream media has moved to a place where the facts just don't back that up. So I do think as a baseline to begin that, I think we're in a better place probably than we have been on that score.
The next question is from Nisha.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so excited to meet all of you. My name is Nisha Sayed. I am a sophomore at Harvard College studying government. And in my American government class, we were talking about the bread and peace model and how the economy reflects a president's chance of re-election. And I was really interested in what, Todd, you were talking about, like polling numbers and how a lot of them come from like, were not properly done in 2016, or like a lot more misinformation. So what would you say in relation to the current like model showing that Trump would get reelected, but the polling numbers not actually demonstrating this trend? So when you said that in 2016, the polls showed like a hidden Trump vote, but didn't really because we overlooked it, would you say that it has changed now? And based off this reflection, like what has the media done to, I guess, like present Trump at whether a negative or positive light based off these numbers?
Are you referring to an academic or one of the academic models taking
Yes.
the economic growth and then projecting whether a president wins, right?
Mm-hmm.
Look, I am the academic modelers got to dunk on everybody in 2016, right? Because all the academic models pointed to a new party becoming, a new party taking the presidency. And they said, we're going to ignore the polls, we're going to ignore the candidates, we're going to stick to our models. That turned out to be the right thing to do, right? I think Alan Lichtman was the most famous of that. I will say this, what I take issue with is this idea that the economy decides elections. I'd like somebody to tell me the last time the economy decided an election. It is, our elections are increasingly culture wars and cultural, and this one feels very much cultural. And how can I prove that? In our polling all year long, the economy is said to be the #1 issue. But what's been interesting here is how politicized even that question has gotten. So in our polling, it says economy is #1 issue. Among those that call the economy the #1 issue, 70% of them are with Trump. So it's a chicken and egg question. What we've seen now is a lot of partisans give what they think is the correct answer more and more now to some polling questions. And I will say this, I think the least helpful questions in understanding the economy are questions about the economy in polls, because you're seeing a lot more answers given based on what they think the correct politics is. It's amazing to me. We saw this shift in real time in our own polling when the second Donald Trump got elected, there were a whole bunch of Republicans who suddenly had a positive outlook about the economy, who before had a negative outlook about the economy. And there was a whole bunch of Democrats who had a positive outlook on the economy, who suddenly had a negative outlook on the economy. Nothing in their life had changed, But this is a case where, for instance, we asked this poll question, the better off question, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And then we asked, is the country better off than it was 4 years ago? Well, a majority told us they were. A larger majority told us the country was worse off, and it's Trump that's losing in the polls, even though he's winning the economy. So I'm giving a long answer to say is, I don't think there is a good correlation anymore between the economy and presidential results. And I could argue we could go back the last 10 presidential elections, and I think it's more of a coin flip about whether the economy was the driver. Narratives get created that the economy was the driver, but that doesn't mean it actually was.
You also this year have this, massive convulsive disruption on top of all of that, which is a pandemic, which is something, no one in this country has experienced in our lifetimes to this scale. And you just don't know what kind of factor that would have, on any modeling or academic research on past elections.
David?
Thank you.
Nothing to add. I'm good with that.
right, then I'm going to give the last question to Carolyn.
Hi, my name's Carolyn. I'm a first-year MPP student at the Kennedy School, and I also work in political advertising. My work has really been disrupted by the new Facebook and Google ad bans on post-election advertising content, and I know they intend it as a way to combat misinformation and disinformation, but my understanding is that that mostly comes through organic posts anyway, like Trump posting on Twitter or Facebook. So I was just wondering, and this is kind of a general question as well, what your all takes on that are as people who work in the news media, and what you think a better path forward could be for information proliferation.
David, why don't you go first?
Sure. I don't think those pre-election day bans of advertising was much of anything other than a PR move. I mean, I just don't think it's going to accomplish much when you look in the details. There's still going to be tons of political advertising on Facebook that was pre-booked, and it just felt more like trying to deal with a PR problem than actually try to deal with the misinformation problem. I think on misinformation side of this, not the advertising side of this, you know, I think and obviously they're still struggling with this and figuring it out, but as Chuck was describing the Hunter Biden story as an example, and how mainstream news organizations are behaving differently, watching how Facebook put into their policies to lessen the distribution of that story, and then Twitter backtracked obviously on that. That kind of stuff seems to me to be down the road of where they need to be heading to actually stop the spread of disinformation, much in the way, quite frankly, that we are in our newsrooms very skeptical of where we can't get the provenance of something, and very skeptical of how we can vet information like that, and then don't do, you know, if we can't meet that up to our reporting standards, we don't do that story, right? And so I think that was a bit of a bigger step for them, and putting that in place, and I'd like to see those tech companies go more and more in that direction.
Look, I'm just going to say one big fat lawsuit that holds Facebook or Twitter liable, when or if, you know, and you know, they have the protection of that Section 230, but that looks like in some form, you know, I'm with David. It's all been PR what they've done. Nothing they have done has been an attempt to fix this problem. It's been an attempt to paint the house, change the color of the house, right? They are just trying to stop asking us this question. See, we're making an effort. We're throwing something at it. You know, I'm one of those who's trying to figure out what good social media has done for society. And if somebody can figure that out, I'm all ears.
Brian, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, a massive distinction between the social media platforms and news organizations is news organizations take responsibility for the content that appears on their platforms. Social media platforms get to call themselves a platform and therefore absolve themselves of responsibility for that. That's the fundamental thing that hasn't changed since the 2016 election and doesn't show any signs of changing anytime soon. And, you know, short of that, it's hard to see where any other solutions are really going to make that much of a difference. The AP is one of the third-party fact checkers that works with Facebook, so I'm going to withhold my opinion on whether that's, you know, a really effective effort. But you know, it is undeniably a small effort, and I think it's been pretty obvious since long before the 2016 election that the vast majority of disinformation gets to people through social media channels. And you know, until you attack that part of the problem, there's never going to be a comprehensive solution.
Gentlemen, we all know that we are living in history right now. And you all and your organizations are going to be presiding over the great feast day of American democracy in 11 days. And so I am as a citizen am encouraged by the care and the thought that all of you are putting in to how to uphold the phenomenal public trust that is going to be in your hands as we steer our way through a very complicated next couple of weeks. So I really appreciate, given particularly how busy this time of the year is for you taking the time to share your experience with us. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all of you who shared this time, and everyone stay safe.
Thank you.
I just have my fingers crossed. That was all words. Fingers crossed for a clean election. Yeah.
Boy, you're not kidding.